There are places in this world where the ocean whispers secrets to those brave enough to listen. Tonight, I am going to tell you about a boy who listened. His name was Cael, and he chased the tide all the way to the edge of everything. Cael grew up in a fishing village so small and forgotten that it did not appear on any map worth owning. The houses leaned against each other like tired old men, and the docks rotted a little more with every passing season. The fish were fewer each year, the nets came up lighter, and the young people left as soon as they were old enough to realize there was nothing here worth staying for. But Cael stayed. He stayed because this was the last place his father had stood before he sailed beyond the horizon and never came back. That was 7 years ago. Cael had been 6 years old, standing on the dock in the rain, watching his father's ship grow smaller and smaller until the fog swallowed it whole. His father had been chasing a legend, a mythical sea called the Dreaming Tide that was said to exist beyond the edge of every known chart. Somewhere in that impossible sea, the old stories claimed, lay a treasure called the Forgotten Crown, an artifact so powerful that whoever found it would hold dominion over every ocean in the world. The village thought his father was a fool. After 7 years of silence, most assumed he was a dead fool. Cael never believed that. He refused to. Something in the way the waves moved, something in the way the wind carried a faint salt sweetness from the west on certain evenings, told him his father was still out there. Hey, and on the night of his 13th birthday, he found the reason why. A storm had torn a hole in the wall of their crumbling cottage, and as Cael patched it with driftwood and nails, his hand brushed against something hidden between the stones. It was a leather journal, cracked and salt-stained, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. Cael opened it with trembling hands and found page after page of his father's handwriting. Notes about currents and constellations, sketches of islands no one had ever seen, and, at the very center, a map drawn in ink that moved. The lines shifted and curled like living things, rearranging themselves slowly as if the map were breathing. It charted a course to the Dreaming Tide, and it was waiting for someone to follow it. Cael sat on the floor of that broken cottage and read the journal cover to cover by the light of a single candle. His father had spent years gathering fragments of the legend from sailors and scholars and old women who remembered the stories their grandmothers told. The Dreaming Tide was not just a sea. It was the oldest sea, the first body of water that had existed before the continents took shape. A place where the ocean still remembered what it was like to be wild and boundless and free. The Forgotten Crown rested at its heart, placed there by the old sea gods as a testament to a time before borders and empires and chains. Cael made his decision before the storm had even passed. He would finish what his father started. He would find the Dreaming Tide and the Forgotten Crown, and he would prove to every person who had ever laughed at the Cael name that the legend was real. He had no ship, no crew, no money, and no experience beyond hauling nets and gutting fish. But he had the map, and he had a stubbornness in his blood that ran deeper than the sea itself. He walked for 2 days along the coast to reach the nearest port city, sprawling mass of salt-crusted buildings and crowded harbors where the Iron Accord's flag flew from every mast. The Accord was the naval authority that controlled every trade route, harbor, and coastline in the known world. They taxed the fishermen until they starved, sank any ship that sailed without their flag, and punished anyone who dared to question their rule, Their warships patrolled the waters day and night, and their officers walked the docks like they owned the ground beneath them, which, in a manner of speaking, they did. He found Rook in a back alley forge near the shipyard, hammering a piece of iron flat with a mechanical arm that whirred and clicked with every swing. Rook was broad as a barrel and twice as strong, with soot in his beard and a permanent squint from years of staring into the fire. He had built the mechanical arm himself from scrap iron and copper wire after losing the original in an accident at the forge. And it was a masterpiece of engineering. each finger articulated, each joint smooth and precise. But the Accord had not valued his craftsmanship for art. They wanted weapons, warship fittings, chains for prisoners, cannons that could level a coastal town from half a league out. Rook had refused, and for that they had burned his shop, blacklisted his name, and driven him to this crumbling alley where he hammered horseshoes and gate hinges for pennies. When Cael showed him the map and told him about the dreaming tide, something shifted behind Rook's eyes. Spark that had been buried under years of bitterness and exile caught fire again. He agreed to build a ship with his own hands if Cael agreed to take him somewhere the Accord could never reach. They shook on it, flesh hand to iron hand, and the deal was struck. Sibyl found him while the ship was still being built, its skeleton rising on the beach outside the city like the ribs of some great beast. She appeared one evening at the edge of the dock, a wiry girl with close-cropped hair and ink-stained fingers, carrying a satchel full of star charts she had drawn from memory. There was a wariness about her, a tightness in the way she held her shoulders, like someone who had been looking over her shoulder for a very long time. Sibyl was a cartographer with a gift that the Accord considered a crime. She could read the ancient star patterns that revealed hidden passages between islands, secret corridors through the sea that had been erased from every official map centuries ago. The Accord had destroyed the original charts and hunted down anyone who could recreate them because those passages were the key to their control. If sailors could navigate freely, the Accord's power would crumble like wet sand. Sibyl was a living map, and they wanted her erased from existence. She had been running for 2 years, sleeping in doorways and fishing shacks, selling small charts to smugglers for enough coin to eat. She needed to disappear, and Cael needed someone who could read the stars. It was a perfect match. They found Marin on a storm-battered island, 3 days' sail from the port, a wild spit of rock and scrub grass where the wind never stopped howling. She had been living alone for nearly 2 years in a cave overlooking the sea, tending a small garden of medicinal herbs and talking to the gulls. She was a healer, trained on a sacred island devoted to the old sea gods, where the priests tended ancient shrines and kept the rituals that honored the deep. Marin had been their most gifted student, a prodigy who could mend broken bones with a touch and brew remedies from seaweed in moonlight. But she had been banished for the oldest crime in the world. God's questions. Questions about the dreaming tide. Questions about the true history of the oceans before the Accord rose to power. Questions about why certain texts in the temple library were locked behind iron doors and why certain songs were forbidden to be sung aloud. She had uncovered fragments of forbidden knowledge that suggested the Forgotten Crown was real and that the Accord knew it. They feared it, and they had spent centuries making sure no one ever found it. The priests had cast her out to appease the Accord, and Marin had carried that knowledge like a lantern in the dark ever since, waiting for someone to share it with. She joined Cael's crew without hesitation, climbing aboard with her herb satchel over one shoulder and her eyes already fixed on the horizon. Dusk was the last to come aboard, and his arrival was the least planned. They found him chained in the hold of an Accord warship that Rook and Cael raided under cover of night for supplies. The ship was anchored in a cove, its crew ashore, and the hold was full of provisions they desperately needed. But in the deepest part of the ship, behind a locked door, they found a man. He was gaunt and silent, with scars on his wrists and a 1,000-yard stare that spoke of things no words could capture. His uniform, torn and filthy, bore the markings of an Accord officer, a high-ranking one. He had been a soldier in the Accord's navy, a decorated officer who had served with distinction for over a decade. But he had deserted after discovering that the Accord was not merely controlling the seas, but hunting something ancient and powerful in the waters beyond the known charts. Something they feared so deeply they had built their entire empire around keeping it hidden. Dusk never spoke of what he had seen out there, but whatever it was had broken something inside him and rebuilt it into something harder and quieter. When Cael unlocked his chains and offered him a place on the vagrant, Dusk simply nodded. He did not speak. He did not smile. We followed them onto the deck and took his place at the rail, and from that moment on, he never wavered. Rook finished the ship in 3 months of back-breaking work. He scavenged timber from wrecked vessels, pulled nails from abandoned buildings, and forged every fitting and bracket with his own 2 hands, 1 flesh and 1 iron. It was not pretty. The planks were mismatched. The mast was slightly crooked. The figurehead was nothing more than a piece of driftwood that happened to look like a bird if you squinted. But it was strong. The hull could take a beating. The keel sat true in the water, and the sail caught the wind like a cupped hand. They named it the Vagrant, because that is what they all were, wanderers without a home, chasing a horizon that the rest of the world had given up on. The night before they set sail, Cael sat alone on the bow of the Vagrant and looked up at the stars. He could feel the map pulsing gently in his pocket, its ink lines shifting, eager to be followed. He thought about his father, about whether the old man had sat in this same position on the night before his own departure, feeling the same mixture of terror and exhilaration. He thought about the crew sleeping below deck, for strangers who had become something more than strangers in the span of a few short months. Each one of them carried scars. Each one had been cast out or beaten down or forgotten by a world that did not know what to do with people who refused to fit into its boxes. And now they were trusting Cael to lead them into the unknown. The weight of that trust was heavier than any anchor, but it also made him feel lighter than he had ever felt in his life. They sailed at dawn, slipping out of the cove before the Accord patrols made their morning rounds. The known waters were familiar for the first day, the same gray-green swells and salt spray that Cael had grown up with. But by the second morning, the sea began to change. The color deepened to a rich and luminous blue, the kind of blue that looked like it went down forever. The air took on a sweetness that none of them could name, something floral and ancient, like a memory of a garden that had existed before gardens were invented. Fish they had never seen before swam alongside the hull, their scales flashing silver and gold, and once, just once, something enormous moved beneath the ship, a shadow so vast it blotted out the light from below for nearly 30 seconds before it passed. The first island they encountered rose from the mist like a dream half remembered, covered in white sand and pale trees that swayed without wind. The water around it was impossibly clear, and beneath the surface they could see the ruins of old structures. Columns and archways and steps leading down into the deep, all covered in coral and anemones that pulsed with soft color. It was beautiful. It was also a trap. The island sang. Low, wordless melody drifted across the water, threading its way into their ears and settling into their minds like a warm fog. It was not a threatening sound. It was gentle, lulling, the kind of song that made you want to close your eyes and let go of everything you had ever known. And that was exactly what it wanted. Anyone who listened too long began to forget their name, their purpose, the faces of the people they loved. Sable was the first to falter, her eyes going glassy as she stared at the shore, the star charts slipping from her fingers. Rook stopped mid-step and stood frozen, his mechanical arm hanging limp at his side. Even Dusk, hardened as he was, swayed on his feet like a man caught in a current he could not resist. Cael felt the pull, wrapped around his mind like silk, soft and insistent, promising peace if he would just stop fighting and let it in. His hand drifted toward the rail, and his eyes began to close. But then his fingers brushed the map in his pocket, and a jolt ran through him like cold water. He saw his father's face, clear as day, and he remembered why he was here. He went to each member of his crew, one by one. He gripped Sable's hands and pressed his forehead to hers, whispering her name and the names of every star she had ever taught him. He took Rook by the shoulders and reminded him of the ship he had built with his own hands. Every nail, every plank, every hour of sweat and fire. He knelt beside Moran and spoke of the herbs in her garden, the hymns she sang to the sea, the questions that burned in her heart and refused to be silenced. And he stood before dusk and simply held his gaze, steady and unwavering, until the soldier blinked and the fog lifted from his eyes. Cael anchored them, not with magic, but with something stronger. He reminded them who they were, and, one by one, they came back. They sailed away from the singing island with their memories intact, shaken but unbroken. The crew gathered on the deck that evening and shared a meal of salt fish and hard bread. And though no one spoke about what had happened, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had been through something together and come out the other side. It was the silence of a crew. Beyond the singing island, the dreaming tide unfolded before them like a story being told for the first time. Each island was stranger and more wondrous than the last, and each one held a trial that tested the crew in ways they had not imagined. They passed through a stretch of sea where the water was not water at all, but liquid light, thick and warm and glowing faintly from within. The vagrant's hull hummed as it passed through, and Sable reported that her charts were shifting faster than she could read them. The stars above rearranging themselves as if the sky itself were being rewritten. Marin dipped her hand into the luminous sea and gasped. She said it felt like touching a living thing, like the ocean had a heartbeat and it was matching her own. They sailed beneath a floating island, suspended above the waves by the dreams of a sleeping giant resting on the ocean floor far below. The water beneath it glowed with a pale green light, and the air hummed with a vibration so deep it rattled their teeth. Carved into the underside of the island were symbols that Marin recognized from the forbidden texts. Instructions left behind by the old sea gods for those worthy enough to find them. The trial was one of trust. Each member of the crew had to stand at the bow of the vagrant alone, close their eyes, and fall backward into the arms of the others without looking. It sounds simple, was the hardest thing any of them had ever done. Aku, who feared nothing that he could see and hit, trembled when he closed his eyes. Sable, who trusted numbers and stars but not people, had to fight every instinct in her body. But they did it, every last one, and the island parted before them like a curtain, revealing the passage forward. On another island, they found a forest of trees made entirely of coral, their branches reaching toward a sky that shifted between day and night every few minutes. Birds with translucent wings perched on the coral limbs and watched the crew with eyes that seemed far too knowing for any animal. Cael walked among the trees and felt a deep vibration beneath his feet, as if the island itself were breathing. At the center of the forest stood a pool of perfectly still water, and when Cael looked into it, he did not see his own reflection. He saw his father, standing at the helm of a ship, sailing through waters that blazed with golden light. The image lasted only a moment, but it was enough. His father was alive. His father was out there, somewhere beyond the next horizon. Cael walked away from the pool with tears on his cheeks and fire in his heart. The next island was trapped in an eternal storm, a howling vortex of wind and lightning that spun around a single calm point at its center. Time moved differently inside the storm. Minutes on shore stretched into hours at sea, and the crew nearly lost the vagrant when the currents dragged it sideways into a wall of churning white water. Dove overboard with a rope clenched in his mechanical fist and hauled the ship back inch by inch while the others fought the sails. His iron arm groaned under the strain, copper wire snapping and sparking, but he held on with a stubbornness that matched the sea itself. Sable navigated by starlight that should not have been visible through the clouds, but somehow was, calling out directions with a calm precision that belied the terror in her eyes. And Marin sang a hymn to the old sea gods that seemed to quiet the worst of the wind just long enough for them to slip through the eye and out the other side, gasping and soaked, but alive. In the calm waters beyond the storm, they found a graveyard of ships. Dozens of vessels from every era lay scattered across the seabed, visible through the crystal clear water. Their masts draped in kelp, and their hulls encrusted with barnacles. Some were ancient, carved from wood so old it had turned to stone. Others were newer, their paint still faintly visible beneath the growth. Cael searched every wreck with his eyes, looking for his father's ship, but it was not among them. He did not know if that was a comfort or a curse. Marin identified markings on several of the wrecks as belonging to keepers of the old ways, sailors and scholars who had attempted the journey to the dreaming tide over the centuries and failed. Their ships had been swallowed by the trials, but their courage had left a mark on the sea itself. Marin said a prayer for each one, her voice low and reverent, and the crew stood in silence with their heads bowed. They understood now, more than ever, that the path they walked had been paid for in sacrifice, but the Accord had not forgotten about them. Word had reached the inner council that someone was sailing the dreaming tide, and they sent their most feared weapon to stop it. The great tide was not merely an admiral, Cael. He was a force of nature, a man who had bound himself to the dark currents, meet the ocean, through a ritual so ancient and terrible that it had cost him his humanity. His skin had taken on the color of deep water, and his eyes were flat and black like a shark's. He commanded a fleet of warships that moved without wind, their black sails hanging limp while the ships cut through the water like blades, propelled by the same dark currents that flowed through his veins. The great tide had been hunting the dreaming tide for decades, not to find the forgotten crown, but to make sure no one else ever could. Dusk knew him. When Cael described the fleet on the horizon, Dusk's jaw tightened and his hands curled into fists at his sides. This was the man who had sent Dusk into the waters beyond the charts. This was the man whose orders had shown Dusk the truth about the Accord and shattered everything he had believed. The great tide was the reason Dusk had deserted, and the reason he had been chained in that hold. He was not just an enemy. He was a nightmare made flesh. The confrontation came without warning. One moment the horizon was empty, and the next it was filled with black sails. A line of warships stretching from one edge of the sky to the other, moving in perfect unison like a single predatory creature. The Vagrant was outmatched in every way, a handmade vessel crewed by 5 outcasts against a fleet built for war. Cael stood at the helm and felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the same weight his father must have felt when he sailed these waters alone. Cael was not alone. Sable saw it first, a shimmer in the water that no ordinary eye could have caught, a faint ripple that moved against the current like a hidden seam in the fabric of the sea. It was a passage, a corridor that existed, not in space, but in the folds of the sea's memory. One of the ancient paths that the Accord had erased from every map. Sable had never seen one this deep or this hidden, but she knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. She called out and pointed, and Cael turned the Vagrant hard, diving into the shimmer just as the gray tide's cannons roared behind them. The world went silent. The sea folded around them like a hand closing, cool and dark and absolute. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sense of motion. And then the hand opened again, and the fleet was gone, and the Vagrant was sailing across water so still and clear that they could see all the way to the bottom, miles and miles down, where ancient ruins glowed with a soft golden light. They had reached the heart of the dreaming tide. The sea here was unlike anything they had ever known. The water was warm and luminous, glowing from beneath with a light that had no source and cast no shadow. The air smelled of salt and honey, and something older than both, something that predated language and memory and time. Schools of fish moved through the deep and spiraling patterns that looked almost like writing, and far below, enormous shapes drifted through the ruins, creatures so ancient and so vast that they made the sleeping giant beneath the floating island look like a minnow. The final island was not really an island at all. okay? It was a place where the ocean itself rose up and formed the shape of land, a living sculpture of water and light and memory. The shore was made of liquid that held firm beneath their feet, and the trees were columns of slowly spinning sea foam that reached toward a sky filled not with clouds, but with images, thousands of them, flickering like candle flames. They were the faces and dreams and memories of every sailor who had ever looked at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond it. Cael saw his father's face among them, smiling, his eyes full of the same stubborn fire that burned in his son, and he felt tears streak down his cheeks before he even realized he was crying. At the center of the island stood a throne carved from coral and bone, worn smooth by centuries of tide and time. It sat upon a raised platform of crystal that caught the glow from below and refracted it into ribbons of color that danced across every surface. Upon the throne rested the forgotten crown. It was smaller than Cael had imagined, a simple circlet of pale gold woven with strands of sea glass that caught the light and scattered it in every direction. It did not look like a weapon. It did not look like a source of unimaginable power. It looked like something someone had made with great care and great love a very long time ago. Cael approached it slowly, his crew standing behind him in silence, and reached out his hand. He half expected a trap, a guardian, a final trial, but there was nothing. Just the crown and the quiet hum of the sea and the weight of 1,000 years of waiting. The moment his fingers touched the crown, he understood. It was not a weapon. It was not a key to power or dominion. It was a memory, the true, unaltered, unbroken memory of the world as it had been before the accord rose and twisted everything to serve their grip on power. The oceans had once been free, wild and open, belonging to no one and everyone. Every sailor had the right to chart their own course, to follow the stars wherever they led, to chase the horizon without permission or fear. The accord had sealed that freedom away, buried it beneath laws and lies and centuries of enforced obedience, and convinced the world that the seas were dangerous, that control was necessary, that anyone who dreamed of something more was a fool. Cael placed the crown upon his head, and he did not become a king. He became a witness. The memory flowed through him and out into the sea like a river finding its way home. It spread across every wave and every current, reaching every shore and every harbor, touching every person who had ever stood at the water's edge and felt a longing they could not explain. Fishermen in dying villages looked up from their nets and felt something shift, a loosening in their chests, a lightness they had not felt in years. Children playing on beaches stopped and stared at the horizon with wide and wondering eyes, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Sailors on accord warships hesitated at their posts, something stirring in their hearts that no order could override, a memory of what the sea was supposed to be. The truth could not be unheard. The freedom could not be reburied. And the accord's grip, so tight and absolute for so many centuries, began to loosen like a knot finally giving way to the tide. Cael set the crown back on the throne and turned to his crew. Sable was smiling for the first time since he had met her. A real smile, wide and unguarded, the smile of a girl who no longer had to run. Rook stood with his arms crossed and his eyes bright, his iron fist resting against his chest like he was holding something precious inside it. Marin had her face tilted toward the sky, tears running freely down her cheeks, whispering a prayer of thanks to the old gods who had waited so long for someone to answer their call. And Dusk, silent, steadfast Dusk, placed his hand on Cael's shoulder and held it there, and when Cael looked at him, he saw something he had never seen in the soldier's eyes before. Peace. They sailed the vagrant out of the dreaming tide and back into the known world, but the known world was not what it had been. The sea felt different now, wider somehow, full of possibility and promise. The Accord's flags still flew from the harbor masts, but they hung limp and faded. and the officers who walked the docks no longer carried themselves with the same iron certainty. Something had shifted beneath their feet, a tremor they could not explain, a crack in the foundation of everything they had built. It would take time for the old order to crumble completely, but the process had begun, and no amount of force or fear could stop it now. The map in Cael's pocket had gone still, its ink no longer shifting, because there was no longer a hidden path to chart. All paths were open now. All seas were free. Cael never found his father. Perhaps one day he would, on some distant shore or some uncharted island, or perhaps the old man was out there still, sailing his own horizon, free at last. Either way, Cael did not grieve. His father had started the journey, and Cael had finished it, not for glory, not for power, but because some dreams are too important to let die. And so the vagrant sailed on, its crew of 5 misfits leaning against the rails and watching the sun melt into the water, headed nowhere in particular and everywhere at once. The ship creaked softly beneath them, a sound as steady and comforting as a heartbeat, and the wind filled the sail with a gentleness that felt almost like a hand guiding them forward. Behind them, the dreaming tide shimmered on the horizon one last time and then slipped quietly beneath the waves, returning to the deep place where legends rest between tellings. The memory it had released would never sleep again. It was alive now, woven into every current and every breeze, a whisper that would reach the ears of anyone willing to listen. Because that is the secret the Accord never wanted anyone to learn. The treasure was never gold or a crown or a throne. The treasure was the voyage itself, the freedom to chase the horizon simply because it was there. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the sound of waves rocking a small, brave ship beneath a sky full of stars. Imagine the creak of the timber and the whisper of the sail and the endless shimmering sea stretching out in every direction. You are aboard the Vagrant now, safe among friends, sailing toward a morning that is warm and golden and yours. Let the tide carry you gently into sleep. Let the horizon wait until tomorrow. You have all the time in the world. Good night.